The title of my presentation is Mapping the Emergence of Indigenous Fire Ecologies, Sociality, and Self. In this presentation, I use a relational framework to explore the properties of indigenous fire ecology, sociality, and identity that emerge through mapping. I look at mapping and wayfinding in Coady communities. And this is an ethno-linguistic group that lives in the western portion of the island of Sumba in eastern Indonesia. And I look at their mapping and wayfinding practices for the purpose of depicting the spatial and temporal flow of anthropogenic fire. Tim Ingold, in his book, in the revision of his book, The Perception of Nature, defines mapping as the engagement of the mobile actor-perceiver with his or her environment. And Coady map their life worlds and their movements around their island, as well as in their narratives about movements. Mapping is an activity that generates knowledge and relays information about perceptions of self and the environment. Coady know the Sumbanese landscape because they move through it and tell stories about their excursions. A person, quote, knows as he goes and performs ambulatory knowing, in Ingold's words, as he moves along a route. And Ingold defines wayfinding, which is similar to mapping, as moving from one place to another in a region, where places are nodes in a matrix of movement. And a region is the matrix of places bound together by the itineraries of their inhabitants. Coady mapped their world and their day-to-day practices. In their mapping practices, Coady, like the Walbiri in West Central Australia, who Ingold describes, tells stories about the journeys of their ancestors. As they traverse the landscape, Coady encounter the ancestors and deities who steadfastly inhabit waterholes, caves, forests, rocks, celestial bodies, and other relatively fixed entities. Thus, they move through a cosmos that is stable in terms of the ubiquity of spirits. In order to sustain themselves physically, Coady must move from house to garden to waterhole to forest to marketplace and so forth. An inability to travel would restrict their ability to accomplish the tasks necessary for staying alive, like finding drinking water and acquiring food. And Coady cleverly articulate both constancy and movement in their mapping activities. The daily mapping practices of Coady people reveal the ways they conceptualize their world and the motivations for their actions. Stories Coady people tell about their own movements through space, as well as movements of their ancestors, identify locations and their meanings. Knowledge about the movement of other living beings, like animals and spirits, as well as environmental forces like winds and monsoons, likewise construct and are constructed by conceptualizations of space. And telling stories about travels through landscapes is a mapping process. The mapping process of narrating stories about the movements of historical figures constitutes longer-term cycles in Coady. The biweekly flow of people from their homes to marketplaces is a type of a shorter-term movement during which Coady people map their environment. Another type of mapping that constitutes even shorter-term cycles in Coady is the daily movements of people in the zones around their homes to manage and access resources. The following depiction of the widow Romboranga highlights the routine paths she travels and her interactions with fire. Romboranga is petite yet strong, and she's demure yet personable. Her thick black hair hanging down to her waist marks her status as a married woman and mother, as do her deep red lips and teeth stained by years of betel chewing. Her beauty, personality, and strength attracted her now-deceased husband, Ratolodo. They married when she was a young woman, and she moved into the broad bamboo-walled, grass-roofed stilt house where Ratolodo lived with his prolific senior wife and their multitude of children, grandchildren, and other resident kin. The honorific Rato that is part of Ratolodo's two-part moniker indicates that he was a man of very high status. Rato is the title for the priests and healers of Marapu, which is Coady's indigenous religion. Rato is also the title given posthumously to highly respected, accomplished men, even if they don't achieve the position of Rato when they were alive. Rato, meaning many ancestors, populate the spirit world of Marapu. Romboranga performed the roles of the companion of a ritual leader by assisting her co-wife with ceremonies in their own house and by accompanying Ratoloto when he traveled to neighboring hamlets to perform traditional ceremonies. Romboranga's domestic duties were to cook, fetch water, wash clothes, feed pigs, gather forest products, and tend garden crops. As a young wife, Romboranga cared for her own and for other women's children. Romboranga, and this is her high status is evident in the large size and the prime location of her garden. A creek traces the downslope boundary of her garden. She thus has easy access to water if she needs to irrigate her crops, to supplement rainfall, or to boost their productivity. She also has easy access to fresh water for drinking and cooking and small pools to bathe in. Most people in Cody do not have gardens or homes in such close proximity to fresh water. Proximity to water, in fact, indicates status in Romboranga's village, which is named Rongo. Unfortunately, the solidity of Romboranga's house was insufficient, and it collapsed soon after her husband died. For several years after her house fell down, she and her children were transient. The houses they lived in during those years were farther away from her garden than her old abandoned house. One of the places they lived was in Jahamuka's and Dita Katoto's house in the hamlet of Latba. And since Romboranga was Jahamaku's father's wife, he was responsible for taking care of her and her children after she was widowed and her second marriage failed. Romboranga and her children enjoy fairly secure rights to the land where her garden is located because she was married to Ratoloto. And Romboranga's horticultural expertise manifests itself in the productivity of her plants and in the health of her children. Romboranga has a small frame and strong muscles from the physical demands of her lifestyle. She manages a relatively large garden with no husband to share her labor. Romboranga's teenage son Domi helps her in her garden sometimes, as does her oldest child Ika when she's not in school. But Romboranga performs the bulk of the labor. And Ima, her youngest daughter, usually accompanies Romboranga to the garden, where she learns how to perform many tasks, including cultivating plants, handling water, and managing fire. And that's Domi with the fire in the middle of that photo. Romboranga is an expert in many dimensions of fire, since she handles fire every day in a variety of settings. In her garden, Romboranga burns vegetation while she is simultaneously taking care of routine landscaping chores, particularly when she's weeding. Most garden fires of this sort are informal or spontaneously ignited when one sees a need to dispose of organic waste, when the herbaceous and grassy elements in their mounds have dried up enough to burn, or when one wants to cook a snack. Romboranga usually burns organic waste in her gardens and yards in the morning. Romboranga handles fire as a matter of routine. The fires she lights in her garden are spatially confined to mounds of flammable materials which consist of weeds and the unusable portions of crops, like the stalks of maize, sorghum, cassava, and rice, the stems of peppers and tomatoes, and the vines of yams and squashes. Romboranga clears flammable vegetation away from around the edges of her burn piles, so bare soil separates the right fuel from valuable plants. With no fuel, fires will not burn, so they usually extinguish when they encounter bare soil or moist plants. Romboranga can manipulate fuel to suit her goals. The bigger her investment in fuel management, the easier her fires are to control. If she wants to burn the dry weeds she has pulled up or cut from around trees in her garden, she will clear all fuel away from around the tree trunks and assemble the dry vegetation into small mounds. After she conscientiously arranges the fuel into tidy piles or rows, and they have dried out sufficiently, Romboranga lights them with a communal lighter, or that she shares with her fellow villagers, or a hot ember, and continues her other work in her garden or underneath the shade of her hut while she watches over the burn. Because of the circumstances of her life, Romboranga's residence patterns, as well as her children's, have been unstable. In 2007 and 2008, Romboranga and Ima were living with Jahamaku and Dita Katoto in Latba Hamlet most of the time. Ika lived with them too up until 2008, when she moved away to attend high school. And Domi moved around among his relatives' house in a nearby hamlet, and sometimes stayed in Latba with his mothers and his sisters. Rombo-Ranga stayed in other people's houses too if, for instance, they asked her to help with a project or if they needed someone to guard their house while they were away. So mapping and wayfinding changed through time for Rombo-Ranga and her children. Their routes when Radoloda was alive and they lived in Katia Malogo with his senior wife and a bustling household were not the same as their routes after he died, and Rombo-Ranga had to rely on the hospitality of others to house her and her children. Rombo-Ranga and her children had to find their way, sometimes together and sometimes solo, through a fragmented social landscape. They altered their paths through the biophysical landscape over time in response to both the social changes they experienced and the textures of their habitat. In 1997, Rombo-Ranga walked a route to her garden that began at her house in Katia Malogo. In 2007, her route began at Dita Katoto's and Jahamaku's house in Latba Hamlet. The change in residency extended the distance of her walk each way by about 2 kilometers, meaning she and Ema, when she accompanied her mother, walked an extra 4 kilometers per trip, and she went to her garden almost every day. Rombo-Ranga's old route took her down from the bluffs of Katia Malogo along a single-track footpath through the agroforest surrounding the settlement, across a creek, and up and down hills through the countryside mosaic of gardens, fallows, fields, and forests. To get to her garden in 2008, Rombo-Ranga walked along a new dirt road that begins in front of Dita Katoto's and Jahamuka's house, cuts through overgrown rows of invasive lantana and chromalina shrubs, runs through the grassy plaza in the center of Katia Malogo, across a concrete bridge over a creek, and rambles broad and white through the countryside. About 3 kilometers from the beginning of the road in Latba, she turned right onto a single-track footpath running alongside a narrow tributary of a creek flowing under the bridge she crossed. Her path curved to the right, then passed through the tributary and climbed up the rocky bank to the other side where it dissolved into her garden. The texture of Rombo-Ranga's habitat transformed over that 10-year span from the dark ground of a stamped-in footpath to the reflective surface of a bulldozed road, from a shaded walk through botanically diverse forests and fields to a sun-drenched tramp along an oversimplified, exposed surface. If mapping is defined as experiences people have while moving through space, then fire has a human-like experience when people carry fire as they move through space, and when they drop fire in the spaces they move through. People transfer social qualities to fire, and fire transfers its qualities to people when they move around landscapes together. The island of Sumba also mixes with people and fire in the mapping process, such that people and fire incorporate the environment into their movements, and vice versa. The incorporation of humans and fire in the island or land are empirically quantifiable, whereas the incorporation of the island and fire into humans are documentable in stories about the ancestors' journeys and in performances such as setting grasses, weeds, and houses alight. Fire mapping is the spatial and temporal movement of fire through the landscape. Fire maps are sketches of the nodes attached to the routes humans take with fires, plus the identification of as much information as is available about the date and time of the fire. Fire frequency, fire severity, and fire effects. Anthropogenic fire has been in the landscape as long as people have, and in this blurry picture, hazy day, you can see the landscape, and a couple of smoke columns maybe you can see coming up across looking towards the plains of western Sumba. So the accurate mapping of anthropogenic fire demands attention to the movements of the people who light them. Fire and people move through the landscape of western Sumba, and people literally carry fire with them as they find their way from homes to gardens to markets to rituals. Fire falters or flares in response to the contingencies of people's lives. At times, fire enhances opportunities, and at other times, it constrains livelihoods. The demographics of western Sumba began with Papuan hunter-gatherers arriving perhaps more than 8,600 years ago along the island's coast, and then moving inland. Austronesian horticulturalists followed about 4,600 years ago along similar routes, arriving along the beaches and migrating inland. Pressure from slave trading caused more people to flee inland from the coast between the 1600s and the 1800s. And then the flow reversed when war caused residents of the Cody Hills to seek refuge in coastal villages. In search of livelihoods, sublineages migrated inland from the coast about 100 years ago. So multiple generations of Cody people have been carrying fire around the landscape. People in fire have been moving around long enough and frequently enough to cause the environment to embody them both together. The ethnography of Cody provides an answer to a question Ingold poses in his chapter, From the Perception of the Environment. The chapter is titled The Temporality of the Landscape. He asks, is it possible to identify a corresponding cycle, or rather a series of interlocking cycles, which builds itself into the forms of the landscape, and of which the landscape may accordingly be regarded as an embodiment? So the answer from Cody is yes, and fire regimes are cyclical, seasonally and generationally. And yes, the Sumbanese landscape embodies fire. Ingold defines embodiment as, quote, a movement of incorporation, a movement wherein forms themselves are generated. The forms generated by the incorporation of human movements through Cody's hamlets and villages, as described in Romboranga's story, are spaces repeatedly cultivated and burned. The botanical profiles of those spaces are direct reflections of these processes, since Romboranga and others use fire to eliminate permanently in the case of weed and crop residues, or temporarily in the case of imperata, unwanted vegetation. The form generated by the peregrinations of recent and distant ancestors is a landscape segmented into settlements, gardens, fields, and forests. These segments are further portioned according to tenurial claims made on the basis of inheritance, exchange, and usufruct. The landscape embodies the migrations of previous generations of Cody who flowed along similar routes between the seaside zones, coastal plains, and interior uplands. The Cody environment embodies, as Ingold says about inhabited landscapes in general, quote, the lives and works of past generations who have dwelt within it, and in so doing have left something of themselves. Indigenous peoples who live in the homelands of their ancestors draw upon sophisticated knowledge and technical skills as they maneuver in relation to climate, weather, and biomass to affect the cycles of fire and other components of disturbance regimes. Indigenous fire ecologies, from the title of this talk, are the ways Native communities use fire to shape their natural surroundings and the systems of knowledge, economic strategies, political goals, aesthetic desires, and spiritual pursuits guiding them. In viable indigenous systems, fire flows along human routes and humans adjust their movements to fire's designs. The interlocking processes of social relationships and disturbance regimes that develop over long periods of time in specific settings are indigenous fire ecologies. In indigenous fire ecologies, Native communities echo the rhythms of birth, death, and regrowth characteristic of disturbance regimes. Disturbance regimes similarly reflect the contingencies, ambiguities, fragmentations, and continuities of social life. And I'll